Good morning. How's everyone doing today? So I'm going to talk about mobile development for web devs. To show you how you can use your existing skills in web to build mobile applications. But why do we even care? Mobile represents the single largest tech innovation of all time. It's 10x faster than the PC boom, 2x faster than the internet boom, and 3x faster than the social networking explosion. These are giant numbers for mobile. Every one of us pretty much has a smartphone. It is rare to find people these days that don't have a smartphone or some kind of a phone that can at least run some basic apps. So I wanted to join this whole revolution as well. I did just that. I built an app. It's also why you don't let developers name applications. It is a Simon Says app that I built fully in Objective-C. Built it using the traditional development strategies. With Objective-C, I got full access to the whole client, all the APIs, all the power. One of the cons, though, is I had to customize it per device. So if I wanted to go to Android, I had to create a whole new code base. I had to learn new languages. Hence why it never made it out of iOS. Because I needed Objective-C, needed Java. It's hard to find teams that know both languages effectively. You can find people that know both languages, but it's like the jack of all trades, master of none approach. It's difficult to do apps. Once you start getting multiple teams, then you start getting divergent features, divergent user experiences. The maintenance becomes more and more. And the whole time I was building the app, it felt like I was pulling the hair out. Luckily, I got plenty of hair left. And I felt like at any point, it was going to all come crashing down. I can't believe that's actually a real road. I can't imagine driving on it. But that was all around the 2010, 2011 timeframe. I swore I would never do another mobile app. It was not a fun experience. Not coming from a C or C++ background. And the memory management piece, what a nightmare. Actually having to do real memory management, not having something auto garbage collect it. Having to worry about pointers, having to worry about all of that stuff that didn't make sense. I mean, it wasn't what I was doing in my day job. I said, never again. Well, fast forward, 2014, I took a road trip. Went out to California for their code camp. And while I was there, I got introduced to what they call the hybrid development strategy, where I finally got to use my web skills, one code base across all the platforms. I did have some constrained device integration, so I didn't get immediate access to all the APIs. But for all the ones that I really cared about, they had plugins that I could easily access the APIs. And it meant HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, now TypeScript as well. I could use all of those skills, build my mobile app, and immediately deploy it to both of the major platforms. Between these two platforms, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of the market. Yes, those people that still have Windows phones, but no one's building apps for it. So 95% of the market, one code base, all the skills that I already know. To make this possible is a critical middleware piece called Apache Cordova. Some people still refer to it as PhoneGap. This is the middleware that takes all of our web code, it bundles it together into the actual native app that you can deploy to the App Store and gives you access to all the device APIs. Apache Cordova is free and open source, and it's nothing more than the middleware. From a runtime perspective, we start with this web view. That's your browser engine. Chromium on Android, WebKit on iOS. Then Apache Cordova sits underneath that as the underlying bucket. And then there's all kinds of plugins. So Bluetooth, video, touch IDs, cameras, network, battery, all the major stuff that you're going to want. When you start looking at anything to do with hybrid, invariably you run across this quote from Mark Zuckerberg. So the biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native. This was in September of 2012. It made sense to some extent back then based off the devices we had. People also proved, just like we all can do, we can all build a bad app in any language. People rebuilt their app. It performed twice what they, actually closer to 10x, what they thought it was going to or did. But from a device standpoint, what did people have back then? A lot of people still had the iPhone 1. 620 megahertz, 128 megs of RAM. It was kind of a toy. It was more phone than it was smartphone. And people that had upgraded the iPhone 4, getting closer to something usable, 1 gigahertz CPU, 512 megs of RAM. You could start to run some nice apps at that point, but anything that was intensive still slowed down. You would still see it be really sluggish. But look at what we have now. Computers in the pocket. 1.4 gigahertz dual core, gig of memory for the iPhone 6, which is what I still have. The 6S increased that even more. 1.8 gigahertz dual core, 2 gigs of memory. And our iPhone 7 went to a quad core 2.3 gigahertz processor with 2 gigs of memory. I've got computers at home that don't have as much power as some of the phones that we have now. So all those constraints that were there in 2012, they've gone. Devices caught up. All of these standards caught up. The browser engines are way faster, way better. Look at the stuff we can do now just on the web with HTML5 with the browser engines. Those same browser engines power the stuff on your mobile device. So we don't have those concerns any longer. But that quote always comes up. So throw that one out when you see it. So how do we get started in this space? Fortunately, there's a good amount of setup. Luckily for Android, you can do it on any OS pretty much. You need the Java JDK 8. You need the Android SDK. You need Gradle to help you with the builds. For device debugging, you're going to want Google Chrome. If you don't have an Android device, you're going to want the Google Android emulator. And then to deploy finally to the Play Store, you need a Google developer account. It's like $25 for a lifetime account. iOS, fairly similar. Biggest constraint, you have to have a Mac. This has absolutely nothing to do with technology and 100% to do with Apple. Xcode only runs on a Mac, and that's one of the primary IDEs that you need. Xcode is the UI editor, all your code editor. They have all the command line tools to do the building. You have a simulator, very similar to the Android emulator. You want Safari to do your device debugging. Then big difference here with the Apple developer account, it's a yearly fee. It's a $99 yearly fee. If you stop paying it, your app does disappear out of the App Store. So for all of you that really want to touch my monkey, I have not kept my account up to date. And so you can't download it, sorry. So that's a lot of setup between these two. That's where the Visual Studio tools for Apache Cordova come in. So for Windows, which is where Visual Studio proper runs, yes, they have a Visual Studio for Mac now, but that's not where the Cordova tools are yet. It installs all these platform dependencies. Everything you saw for Android, it's there, except for the developer account. You obviously have to buy your own account. But out of the box, all the path variables are set up, all the installs are done for me. I immediately start doing some development work. I can technically, with a remote Mac, do all of my iOS and Android work entirely in Visual Studio. And we'll see a demo later on of actually building on my Windows machine and deploying to my iPhone, all connected straight through Windows and Visual Studio. All of those plugins that I mentioned, you can easily find them within Visual Studio. There's a nice UI to add them in. No longer do you have to go search the web and find the plugin and then run some command line, all right in Visual Studio. And then features we always expect to have in Visual Studio, templates for projects. You expect to be able to hook up a debugger, set breakpoints, inspect variables. you expect to be able to do some kind of a device deployment, whether it's to a device, it's to the emulator, or you can actually deploy right to the web. So most of the time when you're doing this hybrid development, you're doing about 80% of your testing right in the web browser because it's so much faster. Anywhere between 10 to 15 seconds, I can do the full deploy, start up the web browser, start up the web server behind the scenes, and start testing. To do deployments to an emulator or a device, you're somewhere in the 5 to 10 minute range typically by the time it compiles everything, deploys over USB, provisions it on the device, installs it. So that's a lengthy process every time you change something. So 80% you're in the browser. So Visual Studio will start that browser up for you, and you get all the same debugging experience as if you were on the device. So pretty cool. So we're going to take a look at a little bit of demo for Visual Studio. Once you install Visual Studio and you want to pick the workflow, it's mobile JavaScript is the workflow you'll pick, and that'll install all the Cordova tooling for you. Once you do that, you get a couple templates. Underneath TypeScript, you will get this blank Apache Cordova project, and under JavaScript, you get the same thing. Only difference, one uses JavaScript, one uses TypeScript. Once you get the project up and running, it will look like this one. So I've already created, actually they created, a weather app sample under the Cordova repository that Microsoft has. You get all your code in the www folder, all your typical HTML code that you would expect. And if I start this up, let's make sure I'm simulated in the browser here. We'll see in a sec, it's going to pull up what the weather is currently, and it's going to display that and look okay. There we go. So it doesn't look all that fancy. It's kind of gray, it's kind of bland. They styled it a little bit, but it looks more like a web page on a mobile app. If I threw that on the mobile app, you would think it's kind of a web page that I threw into an app. But the nice thing that it gave over here is I can simulate my geolocation. So I can change where I'm at on the map. I can change my devices. So I can pick OS versions. See what it looks like on 10. And actually, that refreshed so fast that if I put these side by side, you'll actually see the refresh going on. So that fast, I'm able to change what kind of device I actually want to use. The only thing I can't change is it has to be iPhone, or sorry, an iOS device, because that's what I started was the iOS side of it. If I start the Android side of it, I get Android devices in here. So I can play around with different types of devices, different OS levels. Every plugin that I'm using has some kind of a simulator for it, whether it's battery status, network status. I can turn stuff on and off, see what happens if I set the battery to emulate it's 10% left. Like if I have code to do something at 10%, like stop pinging a bunch of remote services, I can emulate all of that stuff right inside of Visual Studio. I can set breakpoints in here like you normally could, and we'll see that in the next demo here. I believe you might be able to. I have not tried to emulate Bluetooth, but all of the Cordova plugins have some kind of a browser emulator where you can send stuff to it. As long as your device supports Bluetooth. That is the critical piece typically. We can see here that it's got all kinds of different things that I can do. I can do simulators. It's for all kinds of different devices. I can do a local device. If I have a Mac somewhere on my network, I can plug my iPhone in there and send it to it remotely. I get the same thing on Android. So if I switch over here to Android, and you do see all of the Windows stuff here as well. I've not done a single thing with the Windows Phone. But they also allow you with Cordova to do Windows applications as well. So stuff that would go in the Windows Store to install on the desktop. So let's pick Android here, and we'll see very similar stuff gets switched over here. So I got all of the simulate in the browser pieces here for several different devices. If I had Android emulators in here, it would show up all my different Android emulators so I could start them. One thing to be aware with the Android emulator, to get good performance, you have to install the Intel Haxum driver which does not play well with Hyper-V, which means Docker doesn't play well with the Android emulators, because Docker for Windows uses Hyper-V. So if you are a Docker user, you get to turn off Hyper-V when you want to use your Android emulators and do the reboot cycle. So I tend not to install the Android emulators and just to have a couple cheap Android devices laying around to do that kind of testing. Questions on just plain Cordova? Because you'll notice up to this point, there's no real UI framework. I have to code my UI framework by hand. There's no pre-built controls. As you can see, everything's the typical divs and forms and list and all of those pieces. So since there's no UI framework, how do I make something that's effective? Because without a UI framework, I would have to figure out, how do I make it look right on iOS? How do I make it look like on Android? And Android's got tons of different device sizes. Luckily, iOS is fairly constrained. They only have about 6 or 7 devices that are still supported. And you know the sizes. Android is like, oh, here's the Android world. Everyone's got different resolutions, different capabilities. That's where the Ionic framework comes in. It's the missing Cordova framework. Because Cordova is just that middleware piece. So it's up to you to pick and choose what UI framework you want to use. You could pick jQuery mobile, which I don't suggest you pick. It's a little slower on devices. It does a lot of DOM manipulation. A lot of the frameworks that originally came out did so much DOM manipulation. It was really desktop frameworks that happened to work in mobile. So Ionic's the other way. It's mobile first. They're just now, 3 years into their project, getting to the point that they're doing bigger devices. They're looking at desktops and iPads and figuring out how can we morph our devices so that they fit into those. But it's mobile first. I really like it's built on top of Angular because that's what I'm building my web apps in. So I didn't have to go learn another framework. They're extremely performance obsessed. They want to, or they've actually gotten rid of the delay when you click on something in a web app. It's waiting to see, are you holding it down so that you get the little right-click menu up to do copy paste. They got rid of that for their application framework. So it immediately responds. They looked at all the transitions for when I go screen to screen, how am I supposed to transition? All the way down to the drop shadows and the length of time that each animation runs. Made it look right on iOS, made it look right on Android because the transitions are very different. And I have zero code redundancy. I don't have to do Android customizations or iOS customizations. They take care of that stuff behind the scenes. I put a grid on the page. It'll make my header on my grid look correct. It'll make each row look correct. If I have links to go to a detail page, iOS gets an arrow, Android doesn't get the arrow. I don't do anything different coding-wise. They do all of that work for me. And they give me tons of controls. So I get the typical tab menu. I get side menus where I click the little hamburger button and it pops out a menu. Get cards, which is what Facebook kind of made popular. You get a header, you get some content, and then you get a footer. Typically that's where you see like the sharing buttons and stuff on Facebook or Twitter. Those are called cards. They give that to you out of the box. List or grids, I get headers, footers, all the different form controls. Buttons galore. Do I want small button, large button, icon only button, icon and text? Do I want a bar of buttons where it equally sizes the buttons across the screen? Do I want a full screen button? They have all these different options for you. They have pop-ups. What you see a lot of times is hover-overs on a mobile website or on any website. If you click a little, like the 3-dot button, it might pop a little, not dialogue, but just a little box up. They also have spinners. Almost always you have spinners in mobile apps. If you're going to any remote service, you need to display something to the user, let them know the app's not frozen, the app's just working. Then they have modals. It's exactly like it sounds. Takes up the full screen, has some kind of content, you get to click OK or dismiss. And then slide box. That's the one you almost always see when you start up a new app and they have an onboarding experience. You get the screen, you click, you swipe on it, it goes to the next little tutorial, or you can skip over the tutorial. All built in out of the box for you. Then we have Ionic Native. That's their version of Cordova plugins. They put a wrapper around the Cordova plugins, and they provide a very common interface. So it plays nice with ES6 and promises. Every single plugin, whether they support promises in ES6, now do. And their goal with Ionic Native is to be able to use it not just in Ionic, but on any mobile platform. From a runtime perspective, we saw this diagram earlier. So now on top of our web view, we have Angular. And on top of that, we have Ionic. How do we create an app? First thing, you need to install the npm task runner extension that's within Visual Studio. We need to go underneath the templates for extensions and add the Ionic 2 templates in. The downside of these templates is they're not Ionic supported, they're Microsoft supported. So they are slightly behind the times as far as versions. Ionic is on version 3, which is just like the Angular 4, it's just an update. But there's a few changes in there. So to get around that, I like to install the npm task runner. I install Ionic on the PC, so I have their command line. I generate my project from Ionic, and then in Visual Studio, when I go File, New Project, actually it's File, New, and at the bottom of that menu says Import from Existing Code. You click that, you point it at your Ionic directory, and everything works. Same features that you would have had within Microsoft templates, but now it fully supports the Ionic pieces. And the only thing you have to add in is in the Task Runner Explorer, you add a before build to run the Ionic build. That was one of the big things they did in the template for you. And we'll take a look at this one. Tooling-wise, there's lots of tooling inside of Ionic. My favorite one, and it seems so silly, is the Ionic and splash screen sizing. Free tool that does it for you in about 30 seconds. Last time I looked, there's 46 different sizes between icons and splash screens between iOS and Android. Imagine having to open up Photoshop and resize your image 46 times and go into the config file and put the right line in there for what the size is, what the type is, what the name is. That's a couple hours easily worth of work every time you change it. Instead, with the Ionic command line tool here, you say, here's my splash screen and icon. It sends it up to their cloud. They resize it, sends it back down, updates your config file, and pulls all the images down for you. About 30 seconds, you're done. Ionic View is a free app that you install on your device where I can upload my code. It gives me this little 6-digit code. I can give you that code. You plug it into Ionic View, and now you can download the app and you can play with it in a sandbox environment. Great way to send stuff to customers, to other team members that might not have a device. It's like an Android device, but you want them to be able to test out just functionality. I don't have to put my beta testers into Apple or Google. It takes a lot of time to set up all your beta testers, and you're limited in the number that you can have a year. Ionic View gets rid of that, just in a sandbox environment on your phone. Not everybody likes to write HTML UIs by hand. Some people like to drag and drop them. Creator is that drag and drop interface. The first two are free. Creator is not free. It is a minimal monthly fee, but it has that full drag drop interface. You can create projects based off of what you have in Creator. It's a great way for business people to kind of mock up UIs and get a lot of the functionality working from a UI standpoint, and then you as developers can actually wire up what data really gets into the controls and the true flow. The marketplace is a place where we as developers can host stuff. So if we come up with a cool template that we want to share, we can either put it up there for free or we can put it up there as some kind of cost. They have controls up there. They have themes for apps, free and paid. And the Ionic team does all the hosting and gives you all the profits. They're not taking a single bit of your profit out of that. So very cool that they put that up there. And it's a great place sometimes to find different themes or components and templates. You know someone's done those. You want to do login screens. You want something that looks nice. There's several different login screens that are up there. download them, put them in your app, you're ready to go. The last piece is the Ionic platform, which is a paid platform. It has push notifications, it has Ionic build, so basically continuous integration in the cloud. Kind of a setup, it'll build iOS and Android devices for you, and it gives you the output. They also have the Ionic deploy, the ability to update your app on the phone real time without going through the App Store, as long as you don't update the binary, which is stuff like putting a new Cordova plugin in would update the underlying binary. If all you're doing is updating your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you can update right on your device, skip the whole App Store. So that's a huge deal if you've ever gone through the App Store. It can be 3 or 4 weeks sometimes to get updates in. Versus Ionic, I say, upload to the Ionic deploy. Next time you open the app, it says, hey, there's an update. Do you want to update? You click yes, and we're done. Super simple. That platform is paid. It's ultimately how they're going to make some money. The framework as a whole is open source, is going to stay free. But as a company, they're hoping that these additional tools is what you actually purchase to help them stay alive. So now we're going to take a look at some code for Ionic here. We'll first run this piece. So same build process, actually a little bit longer build process as before, because the first thing it has to do here is actually build all of the TypeScript pieces. So wait for this to finish. Once it's done with that, then it will do this typical Visual Studio build that we saw previously. So with Ionic 2, everything is in TypeScript instead of JavaScript. Good. So that piece finished, and now it is off to the output, and then we'll launch our web browser here. And you will see some very different looking weather app than what we had before. A lot more styles, a lot more features. So we can already see some differences in look and feel with the buttons by default are blue. I threw in a tab control so I can see the current weather. I can see a forecast. I can do every 3-hour forecast. The little flash that you saw that came up was the spinner control. So if I was on slower internet, it would have stayed up for a little longer. I can dig in and see what is the current temperature going to be, or proposed temperature at 6 p.m. tonight. I throw in my zip code. Let's see how ungodly hot it is in Phoenix today. Of course, I leave Phoenix and it's a cool spell at 89 degrees. Next week's like 108 again. So you can see it already just looks nicer. Get refresh buttons in the corner. It looks like it belongs more on a mobile device. From a coding standpoint, we're going to look at the grid here. And actually stop our debugger. So that whole grid that we saw for the forecast is nothing more than this ion list is their grid control. And I say ion item, which is a row, and then loop through all of my output. And it does all the formatting, all the styling for me. I didn't have to figure out on iOS it has the stripe look, it has the arrows or not arrows. All of that totally done 100% for me. If I pull up, we'll look at this app here, and so the next demo is an Ionic conference app. It is a demo that the Ionic team created that mimics a conference application. So we'll be able to show off grids and maps and cards, and there's master detail views, all kinds of different features in here. And as we saw before, we have the task runner explorer that has to do our TypeScript compile. And I would definitely say when I don't have 3 versions of Visual Studio all running on a laptop with 8 gigs of memory, this goes way faster, more like 5 to 10 seconds instead of 30. So back to doing our compile, and in a moment, we're going to launch up the app. While we're waiting for this, any questions? Ionic 1 is built on Angular 1, and Ionic 2 and above is built on Angular 2 and above. I think they're on Angular 4 with their latest release, but not totally positive on that. I know their beta is definitely in Angular 4, but their prod release, I'm not sure for the Angular 2 piece. And I saw another hand in the back.
Yeah, how does Cordova compare to other similar solutions like PhoneGap?
So PhoneGap and Cordova are pretty much the same thing for what Cordova does. PhoneGap originally was bought by Adobe, but they wanted to give away the middleware piece of it to the community, but keep PhoneGap for the intellectual property and the naming. So they split off the building middleware piece, renamed it to Cordova, kept PhoneGap so they could do services like building in the cloud and other stuff like that. So unfortunately, because they renamed it after the community had already picked up on the building, people still associate Cordova and PhoneGap as the same and sometimes different. It's really just the building piece is what Cordova gives you. It doesn't give you the builds in the cloud or any of that stuff. So now that our app is up, see, now it really looks like a nice mobile app. I get tabs in the header here. I get a little left, right kind of menu where I can actually pick. I don't want to see Angular tracks. It's in here. I can get my typical slide out side menu. And in the grids on Android, I get a little line at the very bottom here. Turn back on the Angular piece because obviously I filtered off everything. Thank you. There we go. So you also see some differences in how the UI looks. So all of my headers that are splitting the different groups apart, there's no gray background. It just looks like a normal row to some extent. And then I get different colors on the up-down. So it makes it look like it belongs. The search icon here is what it looks like on Android. Actually, the one piece that always drives me nuts about Android, since I'm an iOS user, is it's totally not obvious that every one of these you can click on to get to the detail page. But that's the Android style, is not to have the right arrow. You can see here I get the back button automatically, and that's the back button you get on Android. We'll see when I look at the iOS, it's going to be different. If I go and look at speakers here, so you can see, obviously I had a breakpoint set from a previous demo. Right in Visual Studio, it did the break. I can go and inspect stuff. F5, let it run. So I can do all the normal stuff I expect in Visual Studio. Look at all the different results. I can hook up all the normal debugging windows, the local windows, the watch windows. There's everything you expect from a C# standpoint for debugging in Visual Studio you get with the Cordova tooling. So here I can see a version of a card. So the name is our header, the middle piece is our content. And in this case, they chose to do all of the social sharing as a vertical menu. So every one of them has this card look and feel. Let's try this again. There we go. So that control, just like we saw Ion list, it's Ion-card. Then you say dash header, dash content, dash footer, and it gives you all of those. The little circular icon for the avatar piece, nothing more than putting an image on there, adding a class called avatar, takes care of sizing them right for you. So lots of built-in functionality. I can get my integrated map in here, all this typical stuff you'd expect, zoom in and zoom out of it. You can see a few controls like the date control in here. We're in our drop-down controls, and it looks like it belongs on Android, since that's how Android pops up drop-down controls. I always love that, for whatever reason, some scripted sandbox always crashes on my version. But if we stop this, we're going to start up the iOS version. We're going to see some big differences here. And from a coding standpoint, there's 0 differences in the code. And let's see if I can cancel that. I got a little click happy and clicked on local device, which is not connected. There we go. Simulate in browser. It does, when you change those, it does take a second to change everything over. So it has to update a whole bunch of targets and stuff behind the scenes. Close those down, gives a little more performance. So wait on our building in. Once this comes up, the things I expect to see that are different, the groupings for the different grids, or the grouping for the grid and the schedule, the header is going to be different. You'll see the right arrows are there. When we click on it, the back button is going to be different. It'll have an arrow and say back on it. The cards will be slightly different. So that's running. We're going to pull up the Ionic docs. The Ionic framework has some of my favorite documentation. So once you're in the docs, in the menu, they have components. Let's pick one of these. When you have it at a big enough resolution, you get this phone-looking area on the right side that's actually showing me an example of what does this code actually look like rendered. That I can click through, I can play with it, I can change it to Android. So every one of their components has that, has ready to go code right here that I can copy paste right into my app. It also has the link for each one of these demos right over to Plunker. So I can play right in Plunker with changing the look and feel and playing around with what would this look like if I did different things. It's a great way to get started. I've done full proof of concept apps, literally going into their docs, copying and pasting out the control I want, changing the data that's being displayed, and calling it a day. I don't know many other frameworks that have that ability to truly get that working. Okay, see if I can finally cancel this. So because I accidentally clicked on the local build, it's trying to go off to a Mac that doesn't exist on this network. Come on. There we go. One more time. So let's see. So if I go back and look, actually a little further back. So back to their docs home page. So we had components. We have all of the API pieces in here. The native piece will get us to all of the Ionic native controls, and we'll be able to see they have about 60 or 70 that are in here. People that are familiar with Cordova always go, only 60 or 70? Because there's hundreds and hundreds in the Cordova plugin repository, but there's also like 30 flashlight apps and 30 camera apps, and it's like there's one in Ionic. So you know this is the one they've vetted, this is the one that they've said we are going to use. So you don't have to figure out which one works well, which one's supported. They do all that for you. Then they give you a very common interface. So in this case, they're doing a geolocation example. Pretty much say when the platform's ready, use the geolocation that I've imported at the very top here. Say, get my current position. It'll use the GPS to get your current position. You can spit out longitude, latitude, and then you can tell it, watch the position changes. So every time the device reports your GPS has changed, you could do something different in the app. And then when you're done, you just say, don't subscribe to it any longer. That's how easy that geolocation where I showed the map in the app, that's pretty much what it is doing behind the scenes for us. Same thing in the weather app when I showed it. It's using the same get me the coordinates and sending those off to a weather API. Super, super simple to use. Really? Try this one last time. Visual Studio is obviously annoyed that I tried to build to a server that doesn't exist. One last try, and then we'll move on to one more demo here. There you go, finished with the TypeScript build. Off to the Visual Studio build. See if it picks the right one this time. Okay. Enough of Visual Studio being dumb. We're going to move on from that demo. And we're going to look at how to deploy to a locally connected iOS device. This one's a pre-recorded demo because last time when I actually did the recording, it was a 15-minute cycle from all the compiles to deploying to the remote Mac, and that was on a non-conference Wi-Fi. So instead, we're going to talk through the demo here. So we've already seen this first piece here, which is building the TypeScript files in Ionic. Once that piece is done, we're going to see that it's going to go try to do that remote build that Visual Studio keeps trying to magically do for us right now. So finished with the iOS build, or with the TypeScript build, off to do the Visual Studio. When it starts up remote build, which is what's running on a Mac. So I have a Mac in the cloud that it's going to try to connect to here. That's what's on the right side of the screen once it makes that connection. And it basically is taking the output of what I compiled in Visual Studio, and it's sending it over the wire to the remote Mac. The remote Mac takes that in. Behind the scenes, it's going to use all the Xcode configs on the Mac, do the compilations, provision everything out, and then we'll see that it sends it back to the Windows machine here in a bit. And it definitely takes a little bit of time for this piece to run typically. Here we go. So it looks like it built. The one thing that's super, super annoying about the Visual Studio pieces here is what you see on the left side of the screen that's scrolling right under the blue. It says attempt 1, 2, 3. When I see attempt, it makes me feel like it failed and it's retrying. What that is saying is it's pulling the Mac to go, are you done with the build? Are you done with the build? And the Mac's going, yes or no. And so that's what each of the attempts are. It's not failures and retries. Once it's done with it, it goes ahead and downloads the build off of the Mac, and then it starts the deployment process through iTunes. And it goes through our normal install process. We get the app up and running right on the phone. I can play with it. I can do all the typical debugging that I'm used to doing inside of Visual Studio. Just everything's on the device. If I scroll back a tad bit, since Visual Studio is being awesome for me, you can see a few differences. So these were the differences I was going to show when Visual Studio decided not to work. You can see the header at the top, instead of being that blue all around like we saw in Android, no longer is it blue because that's not how iOS looks. It's a little tough to see, but all of the headers for the times all have a gray background now instead of being white. The search box is a little smaller with a gray background instead of white. I get my left, right, or actually I get my right arrow into here. If I scroll forward a little bit, then I can see when I go to the detail page, my back button in the upper left has the arrow and says back. That's what you expect on iOS. Then the cards look different as well because it's a grid with details behind it. And the top row has the line between it, and the bottom row has a line above it. All of those things come out of the box. Ionic takes care of every bit of that actually for me. So it means that I get to focus right on my app and not on trying to design it. So business logic, I can quickly get stuff out the door. So resource-wise, we have several. Taco.visualstudio.com is where all the documentation is for the Taco toolset. They have how to get everything installed, how to get it configured, several tutorials about sample applications. In fact, that Ionic 2 weather sample that I showed was out of their documentation. Mac and Cloud, I'm going to show it in a sec, but I touched on that. That's where I'm renting a Mac. So that video, that was the remote Mac. And to enable that, the final package, which is the remote build npm package. That's the service I start up on the Mac. From a Mac side, so macandcloud.com, I have several options. I can pay by the hour with a $30 minimum to get your account started. I can do $20 plus a month. And the plus is all about how many hours a day can I log into the Mac. So for $20 a month, you get 3 hours a day that you can remotely log into the Mac. And all the way up to, I think it's like $50 a month, you can get unlimited access to it. It is a shared Mac, so sometimes, depending on what other people are doing on it, it can be slower sometimes. $50, you can get a dedicated Mac for yourself. I'm on the $20 a month plan because I mainly use it to do remote builds. So I don't need to have it up and running. I'm not logging in to do full work on it. And at $20 a month, it's like 3 years of time before you get a good performing Mac Mini. At that point, you're starting to look to replace the Mac Mini anyway. So much easier, and you can cancel your account at any time. Like the last 4 months, I've been doing a lot of demos and a lot of work in it, so I've kept the account. Come September, I don't have anything on the books for mobile. I'm going to put the account on hold. I don't have anything more than about $80 invested in being able to do all my iOS development for the last 4 months. Much better than $900 plus to actually buy a physical Mac that I'm only going to use to do builds. And it comes pre-installed, everything's pre-installed on the Mac pretty much. Remote builds there, Xcode, all the command line tools, all the Android stuff, all the iOS stuff, everything comes out of the box for you. So all you really have to do is start up the remote build. It'll ask you a bunch of questions about provisioning SSL certs, and it does self-provision certs for you, and then you're good to go. It gives you a PIN number, and then you have a URL that you put into Visual Studio. If you go under Tools and Options in Visual Studio, there's a Apache Cordova section down here. If I look at the iOS configs, it asks, where's my device support folder? So pretty much off the Mac, I have to copy the device support folder, which is all the places that it's going to look for an application when it tries to deploy through Android. It's about 200 megs worth of files. And then I need to know, where's my remote Mac? You get your own PIN number that's unique for you. And then you want to tell it, actually you set your port, and then you get your PIN number. This way you can't access my Mac in my running instances, because I've already provisioned out everything for my Apple account on that Mac, because you have to in order to actually deploy apps onto your device. So I don't want other people playing with it. So it does all that SSL stuff for us. Then it just magically works. Ionic resources. We saw the docs. They have a Slack channel as well, which is what the bottom link is. Their Slack has experts from the community in it, as well as there's almost always someone from the Ionic team in there during the day. It's one of the few Slack channels I turn off notifications and turn off the little blue symbol that I have unread messages, because there's thousands of messages that come across during the day. But it's a great way to get real-time support. There's 3 blogs that I always tend to reference. So Andrew McGivery, even though it says 15 Ionic resources, last I looked, he's actually up to 60 plus. Maybe when Ionic 4 comes out and he creates a blog post for that, he'll stop putting the number in the title. because he did the same thing in Ionic 1, and there's like 200 plus, and it says 60. Josh Maroney, the guy's a machine. He puts out 2 to 3 tutorials every single week for something related to mobile, mainly in the Ionic space. For a while, he was doing 1 a day. DevDactic, which is the last one, Simon recently came out with an Ionic course. We'll see in the next slide, he also has a book, and there's tons of tutorials. And book-wise, there's 3 main books. So Josh Maroney had the very first Ionic 2 book, and he has been keeping up that book every single release. I've been getting notifications anytime he has to do updates to both the book as well as the code examples. And he has tiered model for that book. $30 gets you the book, 1 sample app, and maybe a template for the icons, all the way up to $120 or $130 gets you like 5 applications, a couple templates, a checklist for how to deploy into the App Store. And so it's pick and choose which level you want. The DevDactic also has a book, 0 to App. And then recently, O'Reilly released an Ionic 2 book as well. To get a hold of me, my website's digitaldrummerj.me. I'm on Twitter at digitaldrummerj. If you start using the tool set, you have questions, hit me up. I'll help you out and get you unstuck. With that, I'll let you know if you can make a great web page, you can make a great app. It's time to go create your mobile app. Thank you. And there's the link to the slides. Absolutely.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Quick question for you. So I've been wanting to develop for a while, and the only thing other question I have, I do have a Mac. So